Good afternoon to all of you. My name is Ana Principi, and I'm the Undersecretary of Institutional Relations and International Cooperation at the School of Humanities and Educational Sciences at the National University of La Plata. I would like to welcome you all to this, the third cycle of conferences we are holding as part of this new joint project between the USA and Argentina, share dialogues on gender, ethnicity, geopolitics, history, and memory. The project is one of the beneficiaries of the U.S. embassies in Argentina's grant program for cooperation and exchange projects, and the University of La Plata is extremely grateful to the embassy for choosing and sponsoring this series of conferences. I particularly like to thank Lucia Batista, Ana Barletta, Enrique Garguin, Fernando Rigone, Ignacio Celani from the School of Humanities and Educational Sciences, also Fernanda Tocho, and of course, Jessica Steitz as well. And also the Master Program in History and Memory and the Secretary of Human Rights at the School of Humanities and Educational Sciences as well. At these events, 22 professors from the USA and Argentina will discuss and call into question the connections, intersections, and points of contact between concepts such as ethnicity, class, feminism, testimonial literature, translation, decolonial turn, and English and language teaching, geopolitics, history, and memory. This speaks of academic bonds, both previous and reinforced by the project. Academic bonds and dialogues. This is in part the richness of these seminars. Conversation as a methodology implies listening, expressing ideas, questioning, looking for answers, rethinking, sharing, and constructing together. It is a collaborative work, but apart from these bonds, between scholars and institutions, I have no doubts that the lectures will also encourage the audience to ask questions, to revise concepts, to engage in new discussions as well. At today's session, we will hear from Dr. Jessica Steitz more. Thank you, Jessica, again. And Fernanda Tocho will introduce her. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the third session of these virtual conferences called Colonial Legacies, Popular Memories, and Intersectionality in the Social Mobilizations of Our Time. These conferences were organized by the Master Program in History and Memory and the Human Rights Department of our school. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to thank Ana Principi, the Undersecretary of Interinstitutional Relations of our school, who is the coordinator of the whole project. Today, I will introduce you to Jessica Steitz, who will share with us a presentation called South-South Solidarity, Reassessing the Paradigms of Social Movement Theory through the Latin American Experience. Jessica Steitz has a BA in History and Economics from the University of Kansas, a PhD in History from Yale University, where she also holds Master in International Relations. Her research project focuses on transnational solidarity movements, left, politics and culture, and film history, with a focus on the particularities of South-South transnational activities. She investigated the role of cultural productions such as cinema, photography, and media in shaping relations between Latin America and other regions of the Global South, especially the Middle East and Africa. She currently works as an associate professor in the Department of History and Sociology in the University of British Columbia. I leave you with Jessica, but first I just want to remind you that any question or comments you want to make, you can write them in the YouTube chat. Okay, Jessica, we hear you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so delighted to be a part of this series and to be in conversation with such a brilliant group of scholars. Thank you, Fernanda, Luisa, Enrique, Garvin, and everybody who made this possible. I'm also really delighted to be able to speak to an Argentine audience further afield than my academic friends, in that this project really originated when I lived in Buenos Aires and started working on connections between the Argentine left and the PLO during the 1970s, and kind of the further imaginings of a relationship of solidarity with Palestine within Argentina, in particular Buenos Aires. And so today's work is really about the next project that came after the first. And this is a project that is making a contribution in some ways to 3 different distinct fields. And so I just kind of want to spell out what I think this book project that I'm talking about today is trying to do. And then I'll give you a little bit more of the detail on some of the findings and kind of the into the weeds research. So one of the big concerns that I had working in Argentina, where I lived for 5 years while I was finishing my PhD, I recognized that a lot of the research on Latin America's foreign relations with the rest of the world seemed to be centered on how it related or triangulated through the United States, through Europe, through the Cold War. And I found that it seemed to lack any precision when it came to Latin America's relationship with other parties elsewhere. And so I felt like there was something that was really missing about these dialogues, these conversations, and also beyond that, the centering of kind of the continually recentering of the Cold War or US foreign policy goals seemed to neglect sort of the nuances between relationships among partners within the global South. And so one of the first big kind of arguments that I tried to make in a previous volume called Human Rights and Transnational Solidarity was an argument about positioning South-South solidarity movements as a new frame of reference to sort of shift our paradigms about how we think about these international relations, and to ask the big question, is there anything different about foreign relations between parties of the global South? When it's not about protecting and maintaining empire, do they look different? You know, how do partners engage with each other when there isn't this question of extreme hierarchy or a need to preserve a certain order? And what would happen if people were, if different partners in solidarity thought of each other genuinely as partners, of having reciprocity, having a different kind of exchange? So that was the first big question that I had. And the second big kind of question and challenge that I had was that frequently when I would ask this question, why don't we look at, for example, relationships between the Middle East and Argentina? Why don't we think more squarely about that? I would hear answers from fellow historians, from policymakers that, well, they just don't matter that much. They're not that important. And I really thought that that was a troubling sentiment, and I wanted to push further. And when I would ask, you know, what do you mean by that? What do you mean it wasn't that important? I would hear answers like, well, they failed. They weren't successful. These solidarity movements that you talk about, they happened in the 60s or the 70s, and then they end. They don't eventually remove Pinochet from power. They don't necessarily move military forces around the globe. They don't topple dictators, in Cambodia. And so they're failures. And I was really sort of unsettled by this idea, and I thought it was wrong. It didn't make sense to me that we would only measure things as success or failures if they accomplish these enormous goals. You know, to be able to be anti-fascist doesn't mean you completely and permanently can defeat fascism, right? Like, so even in the global North, these kinds of movements were being examined and given much more credit than those movements that were coming from the global South. And so I thought perhaps our social movement theory didn't allow enough room for us to decide what success and failure really meant. That the ways in which measures were being created might be somewhat off. And so I started talking to people who study social movements from sociology, from political theory, other historians, to try and kind of recraft a way to think about movements and their various accomplishments. And the last thing that was sort of a problem of this research that kind of pushed it forward another step was that in working on, as a Latin Americanist and a person who studies Latin America from the global North, I grew up in Kansas, there was always this thing that made me feel uncomfortable reading accounts of scholars who had never traveled to the places that they studied or didn't have an embedded knowledge in those places. And so one thing that with a handful of my collaborators we sort of decided was necessary was to think about scholarship in a much more collaborative way. in order to sort of get at more meaningful results of what these partnerships between peoples who didn't always even speak the same language were really about, there was no way we could simply look at documents written in English or exclusively in Spanish, that we needed to be able to get into archives across oceans and work with people who were experts in those places. And that meant really rethinking what it meant to do this kind of scholarship, that in fact, we would have to work in really big teams instead of just as isolated individuals with our knapsacks in the archives somewhere in the global north, or even lovely places of the global south as well. So these big three questions were at the foundation of this new book that I've just published, called South-South Solidarity and the Latin American Left. And the book kind of takes as these sets of concerns, that takes them and approaches them, it approaches the Latin American left through these three big questions. And in general, the book is setting out to sort of create a space that reclaims the history of the left and reinvests it with a lot of the sort of purpose and meaning that is particular to the time periods and also to the movements that were so important in shaping the decades of the 60s and 70s and onward, and rethinking about their importance to the present. Like, what was their lasting impact? What were the afterlives of the solidarity movements of the Latin American left? And what do they mean to us today? Which relates a little bit to what I'm going to get into in terms of how we think about social movement theory. And one of the first questions I try to answer when I start this research is I start by trying to define solidarity, because this is a term that's used by lots of people in many different ways. On my Facebook page, people are in solidarity with all kinds of things. And I think it means different things depending on the context, of course. But for the purpose of this study, I wanted to narrow down the scope of what I was looking at to transnational solidarity between South-South partners. And I was thinking about solidarity with the following definition. Solidarity is linking the notion of collective responsibility with that of cooperation in pursuit of shared political goals. Something simple, something that didn't necessarily imply a transfer of personnel or resources, but something that certainly articulated a political position and allowed different parties on both sides to orient themselves toward both each other and towards broader political struggles. In this way, I use the term solidarity to reflect complex relationships in which one group might engage to defend itself or others against exploitation or injustice committed in spaces that they're not as familiar with, but they have some kind of framework for, some kind of familiarity with, or some common cause. And so I'm kind of moving away from other ideas of thinking about solidarity, which get employed by welfare states like Mexico, other kinds of social movements. Labor organizations use this word in a slightly different way, as do legal advocates and activist organizations. But I'm thinking about it rather broadly. And so I'm really kind of looking at the Latin American left and their political institutions and the way that they express themselves through the variety of kind of cultural and textual output. And so this is the way that I've sort of tried to narrow down this really broad question and think about solidarity more specifically in this space. And so in Latin America, transnational solidarity movements, which have been a feature of Latin American political organizing really since the beginning of these nation states and before, you could look as far back as early movements of Pan-Americanism, but I decided to start at a moment of time in which we have a lot more material to study. And I also decided to choose cases that, we could agree that even if they weren't necessarily obvious successes, they definitely were meaningful. I didn't want there to be a question as to whether or not I was inventing their success out of thin air. And so I wanted to look at the movements of the 60s and the 1970s, movements that left a lasting impression and that, are considered still really important in terms of the consciousness of the global South and the ways in which it still organizes itself in solidarity. And so the case studies that I looked at were four. The first one I looked at was the case of the receiving of Chilean exiles in Mexico, and how this movement of reception had been kind of an iteration of a long process that had at its helm legal scholars, communities in exile, many activist groups, student groups that had laid the groundwork for a successful path forward for those who were escaping when Allende's regime was toppled in Chile. I also looked at probably one of the most popular transnational and broad transnational social movements, that of OSPAL, the Organization of the Peoples of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and Cuba's sort of intervention through both the non-aligned movement and also through OSPAL in creating a cultural production that would reach to a wide audience to help in what I call rendering these conflicts visible and intelligible to populations far beyond Latin America. I also looked at Argentina and its relationship with the PLO. And in this case, I sort of wanted to turn the lens inward and say, you know, what does having solidarity with Palestine and Palestinian nationalism, what does it mean to Argentina? What does it mean in these different spaces, which involved really looking independently at different political parties, because the resonances are distinct and different periods of time mean different things to different individual actors. And last but not least, and probably one of the most maybe controversial aspects of the book, is I was interested in looking at liberation theology as a social movement tied to Marxist intellectuals in the Latin American left as it moves into Africa, in particular Southern Africa. And the way that even if people aren't necessarily moving, if bodies aren't necessarily moving across the ocean, ideas, sentiments, organizational strategies, plans, and ways of protecting incipient human rights movements and national independence struggles kind of were aided and assisted by eventually circuits within the Catholic Church that were kind of in a counterposition to the church's more conservative position towards those liberation movements. And so I look in particular at how cells within the South African Church were mobilized by peace and justice commissions that were an invention of the Medellin Vatican II meeting as a way of creating a space for observation, for observers, and for reporting and for collection of data to mobilize international support on behalf of particular causes in all around the world where these cells were kind of created as part of the church, and in particular how the one in South Africa got involved in assisting the apartheid and the anti-apartheid movement. And so I look at the relationship of liberation theology to that long-term struggle, both in providing intellectual support and also in terms of providing real spaces where organizing work can take place. So these are the 4 case studies of the book. And I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how each one of them relates to my kind of reconceptualizing of social movement theory. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the broad generalizations that I found when thinking about these objections of my colleagues when I would suggest that these were important moments in time or important to kind of continue to study. And many of the scholarship and many of the sort of standard ways of thinking about social movements I realized came from these sort of quantitative sources of analysis. And I'll just list these here for your benefit and just to kind of put them all in a long pile here. The idea that movements would be failures were considered to be like, according to the failing on the following grounds. So one failure, if people actually fail to mobilize, if things end up, not coming out and being in the street, if there are ideas and there are not protest movements that immediately follow and stay in the streets, failure to get people to be organized. This was considered to be one of the major failures of social movements. And when you think about the context of military dictatorship, it's easy to say that, well, then repression, just that answer is repression, and there's no way that you can, find any way forward if there's no space. The second kind of failure of social movements, that according to social theorists, the idea that movements sometimes change shape, that they don't always have the same dimensions. And so the movement that starts out in support of one cause might move away from that cause or the purity of that cause. And so if they don't accurately represent the cause from start to finish, that this is also a failure, that movements are somehow supposed to not transform themselves. They should be about one thing and stay about that one thing. Another failure, a failure to be recognized. So if a social movement doesn't necessarily get a stamp of acceptance by the parties that it is speaking to, if it's not recognized by national leaders, local leaders, or international actors and figures, that somehow it shouldn't have or didn't exist in a way that was meaningful. In addition, the idea that they might not necessarily be able to kind of stay pure in terms of their organizational factors, that a lot of social movements are criticized because eventually they have some kind of corruption or some kind of leadership problems. And so, the failure to kind of continue to maintain a particular structure seems to be another reason to dismiss these. But by far the largest reason that I was given that these movements and these relationships between Latin American countries and the global South were not meaningful was that they simply didn't overturn the major powerful players in the region, that they weren't in fact able to resist the advances of the United States or of capital or of a military dictatorship, that they were simply not powerful enough. And I suggest in this research that perhaps we need to think more broadly and in a much more sort of socially and culturally informed way about what these movements really meant, that if we only look at power and money and violence to make our measures, that perhaps we've got our focus on the wrong, in the wrong direction. And I come, of course, as my first book was on film history. So I'm very convinced in the power of culture and the power of the way that people organize themselves in spaces that are not necessarily sanctioned by the state. And I think that taking this sort of more nuanced approach really broadens our focus and asks us to look at movement actors, why they come together, what they're doing when they're together, and to ask us to not reduce them, to think about solidarity movements as not reducible to just a manifestation in the street or a particular NGO coming out of a movement and having a specific means to end. A critical feature that I find in looking at transnational solidarity movements is that they often exhibit what I call iterative and generative properties and have vital influence not only within different iterations of the movement, but also outside of the movements. So I'd like to kind of consider solidarity as a process. Movements themselves, I think of as pathway spaces, places where subjectivities can be crafted, reshaped, arguments can be had, positions can be realigned, they can change, and they don't just take place within the movement, they take place on all the edges of the movement. That everyone brings different things to a movement. They have their own lives, they have their own families, and movements don't stay contained in that space. Somebody who participates in one movement might participate in many others, might change their positions radically within the time period that they're politically active. May end up, in some cases, and ending up being hired by the state and having to readjust professionally to having been successful at having their causes recognized, and then having an entirely different kind of relationship to the problem. And so I ask for, in thinking about these case studies, for people to think about how transnational solidarity and South-South relationships went far beyond just the known diplomatic actors and involved individual participants, people who had private lives that were quite rich and interesting, and that their long-term meaning and impact took on a much broader variety of forms. And that in this sense, if we kind of begin to think about these as irreducible to simply the political objectives that they signal, that perhaps their afterlives are much more meaningful, and we can begin to kind of think about them as successes in a different way. Okay. So then so the book takes these four main case studies, and it tries to think about how each one of them, as a first foray, and I hope there are many more. I hope that that the work that I'm doing here inspires other people to think even better and smarter about these questions. But the first case studies led me to a handful of conclusions just based on what's special about the Latin American left and what are the lessons that we can take away as global historians thinking about the contribution of the Latin American left to what we understand as global solidarity today. And so one of the really kind of unique features I found has to do with something that Ray Crabb argues is the revolutionary state. The idea of a state that considers itself to be based on a revolution and to have a continuing commitment to revolution. according to David Armstrong, who kind of laid out the original sort of term, a revolutionary state is one whose relations with other states are revolutionary because it stands in some sense for fundamental change in the principles on the basis of which states conduct their relations with one another. And so, in a way, a revolutionary state is constantly in not just a product of revolutionary change, but it's also constantly in the pursuit of more revolutionary change. And in theory, can have relationships with non-states in order to support revolution in other places. Examining Mexico from this is, of course, a very complicated example. The Mexican Revolution is, of course, one of the most important kind of events of the 20th century, but has its ups and downs. But looking at Mexico as a revolutionary and refusing to call it a post-revolutionary state speaks to the way that the left keeps pushing at the boundaries of what's possible. And in this sense, people both within the PRI and outside of the PRI keep pushing revolutionary goals into the center of their projects. And as Ray Craib also kind of explains about Mexico, to see the Latin American state from the vantage point of how people experienced the changes brought on by the revolution. True revolutionaries would be those that enforce the revolutionary constitution. And declaring itself to be a revolutionary state, he says, Mexico illustrates a model for change that can be embraced in other parts of Latin America. We see, echoes of the Mexican Revolution in Cuba, Nicaragua, many other places. But also we see this idealism that actors within Mexico can appeal to on a regular basis, asking of their leadership to constantly come back to the constitutional goals and the idea about what revolutionary state making means. The force of the revolutionary state's ideals and its tensions with the realities of state making can be seen in this example that I have brought today of the case of Chilean, specifically through Mexico's approach to asylum law. And this is an argument that I'm not alone in, I think, endorsing, but looking at the way that Mexico's early approach to asylum seekers in the Inter-American Treaty System provided the Mexican government a way and a place to assume a revolutionary posture within the region that both allowed its leaders to seem as if they're upholding the goals of the revolutionary constitution, but also to enact a form of autonomy in a way, pushing back at the goals of the United States and later of the United Nations through the Council on Refugees. Looking at this case, one of the things that I sort of study in detail, I look at the struggles of legal reformers who were very much informed by the experience of a very famous case in which an asylum seeker, Jaime La Torre, an aprista from Peru, ends up trying to seek asylum in Mexico, ends up stranded for many, many years, and ultimately, the Inter-American system doesn't necessarily provide a path forward for securing his refuge status when it's sought between Colombia and Mexico. And part of what is observed from the Peruvian exile community in Mexico and legal scholars of international law in Mexico is that the International Court of Justice and the Inter-American Treaty System is designed to support whoever's in power. It's not designed to necessarily support revolutionary goals or those who might be pushing against even corrupt states. And so these legal scholars began to articulate that one of the most important sets of concerns that Mexico had was being able to enact its own vision for determining whether or not someone accused of a crime was a common criminal or was actually committing a political crime. And the International Court of Justice said that that was not up to Mexico to determine. And so Mexico decided to bow out of the handful of next rounds of signing on to convenios and refuses to become a part of the United Nations attempt to harmonize refugee policy and create new organization in order to maintain its own autonomy. It even goes so far as recodifying in 1970 penal law in Mexico to be able to really further define what a political crime is and to give it greater kind of abstraction, to be able to capture more variety of things, to allow for a meaningful domestic definition of what it means to commit a political crime, and to give it a really easy way to be distinguished from what might later be called acts of terrorism. And so one of the chief kind of architects of this work, he manages to create 3 different kind of subcategories of political crime, and they each have something in common, which is that they each have common goals at their center and a way in which any particular individual act can be considered to be an act on behalf of a broader cause. And so he allows this to be sort of one of the chief domestic interventions, recrafting domestic law to be able to continue to sort of support Mexico's position in terms of maintaining its sovereignty in determining who can or can't be considered a refugee entering the country. And so that's just one of many ways in which Mexico's appeals to its own revolutionary goals allow for an increased support for solidarity movements. Like, this is a movement that began with Peruvian exiles and then builds this groundwork. They learn a lot of lessons watching what happens to Haida de Torre. They notice that, the kind of protections for someone's bodily integrity as it moves between these different spaces is of chief importance. They learn that the faster someone is able to move out of the country where the crime is allegedly committed, the better chances they have of survival and the better chances they have of being able to support further a movement. All of these kind of learning on the ground translate into the 1970s, being able to have a legal structure that's able to immediately react to the fall of La Moneda in Chile, and immediately to be able to translate those knowledges into immediate support for the Popular Unity Party. So that's one example, this idea of having a revolutionary state. That's something unique about Latin America that you don't have absolutely everywhere. This idea that you can appeal to these revolutionary constitutional goals, for better, for worse sometimes. Another sort of finding, and this one I think is probably one that is more abstract than this previous one. Cuba's state-led revolutionary government in 1959 begins to sort of think of itself as also wanting to export revolution to the rest of the world because it needs support for its own revolution, its own sort of campaign of resistance against the United States, and doesn't have the same kind of economic security or regional influence that Mexico does. And so, faced with a different set of concerns, Cuba, as a state, begins to look at ways of connecting outside of the region to kind of reinforce not only its own security in the world, but also to kind of help bolster local perspective of whether or not the revolution has been successful, having that outside validation of revolutionary goals. And among many other, sort of a host of other objectives. By 1966, Cuba hosts 82 nations at an international congress intended to champion a Latin American vision of solidarity between regions of the global South. And they decide that they want to kind of craft a new term. They're interested in influencing the non-aligned movement, finding themselves in those spaces. But they use the word tricontinental, and they try and bring together Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the 3 continents that have suffered from colonialism, and try and craft a new political consciousness through this lens. This new term responded in particular to the failures of previous forms of international political community that had not really taken into account many of the sort of racialized perspectives that were kind of grounding the international system and affecting in particular populations in diaspora, as well as racialized populations of newly independent nations. And Castro himself was quite interested in thinking about a deterritorialized conceptualization of imperial power. And this was his way of learning what the United States' involvement in neocolonialism in Latin America, what that kind of had to offer the rest of the world in terms of looking out for the dangers of finance capital, looking out for the way in which all of these different kinds of military pacts and alignments were sort of continuing to promote a certain global order that would always keep certain people down. Cuba welcomed political, intellectual, and cultural leaders into Havana, organizing the city into a hub of activism at the center of revolutionary exchange. And at the center was cultural production. And the state managed to commit tremendous resources to the act of creating films, comics, poster art, magazines, bulletins, all kinds of materials that could be easily translated and sent through diplomatic pouches, through friends' backpacks all around the world, and had one of the most extensive sort of distribution campaigns of ephemera that probably the world has ever seen, and certainly for the time period. And one of the things that I kind of think about is like Latin America's contribution to how this helps to shape solidarity movements, both in specific places where it reaches, but also more broadly in the non-aligned movement and in anti-colonial struggles that come in these different shapes and forms, is that Cuba's revolutionary state had a project that I consider sort of helping to define these struggles. I use this term rendering, the idea of mobilizing historical agency in a cultural form, using visual objects, using texts that are produced as an act of solidarity, shaving off edges, giving form, kind of making the right apt metaphor, building on conceptual arguments that transnational social movements can help to frame the discourse itself, that they can present performative spaces, that they can create ways that people can see themselves differently, ways that they can understand their situations differently, and also be able to relate to struggles that they don't necessarily have much real physical contact with. And I use this word rendering as well to kind of, I play around with this a little bit in the way because to render can mean to draw, it can mean to design, it can mean to craft, but it can also mean to render service or to render judgment. And I think that there really is this way in which Cuba also offers these very specific positions. So for example, when they offer solidarity to Palestine, they definitely choose sides, and they decide, you know, which party, which groups of Palestinian nationalists are the ones whose intellectual work should be privileged and put side by side, but, you know, with the speeches of Ho Chi Minh and Che Guevara. They also spend quite a bit of time, artists, the people who are the journalists that are involved in these many projects, doing research about local struggles, contacting local photographers, local artists, local movement figures, and trying to help craft for them, kind of in a PR way, a certain image that fits into this image of what it means to be a part of this struggle. And so, you know, many of these posters and images that circulate, they reframe these struggles in ways that will be not only intelligible across borders, but also will fit into a particular kind of grammar. One that centers the idea of racism as a product of neo-imperialism and colonialism, an ongoing thread of those projects. One that also situates armed struggle as an important part of resistance, and one that also sort of continues to provide this ongoing critique of democracy as not necessarily always so fulsome, by critiquing the United States, by critiquing South Africa, by critiquing places where the democratic process is really only available to a few or to the privileged classes. And so in this way, the Cuban kind of cultural campaigns that manage to reach audiences around the world provide this ethical framework, this conveyance of both ideas, revolutionary and sort of even some that are playful, satiric, that help to both mobilize political consciousness, but also to bring people into almost an aesthetic experience of revolution that's both playful and fun and invigorating. The idea of the soldier as young and intelligent and educated and a part of something bigger was something that helped to kind of reshape and reframe the involvement of people on the ground in such a way that they saw themselves as less foot soldiers and more revolutionary actors. So Cuba's production and circulation of cultural renderings in solidarity reveals to me, at least the Cuban revolutionary state, to kind of having a Latin American imprint on what internationalism would look like. And I think that that lasts well into today. And I think that that's one of the major contributions as well of Latin American left during this period. I think I'm gonna maybe leave the work of Argentine political parties and kind of thinking about Palestine is maybe a bit of a dicey question for this audience. So perhaps I might just leave that, but I will say that one of the things that was really interesting to me as a newcomer to Argentina, I was there during 2001, 2002, 2005. And so, you know, in the streets, there were plenty of people who were coming out in support of a variety of campaigns, in particular, you know, the financial crisis, you know, the cacerolazos. This was a moment where people who didn't necessarily always participate in social movements were participating. And my first sort of clue that this was going to be an interesting topic, you know, to explore further was that I noticed that early on, young people in particular started wearing the keffiyeh, the Palestinian nationalist black and white checkered scarf, as a way to distinguish themselves. Like, we're not exactly the same as that other group over there. They're hanging out and they're interested in the McDonald's, but, you know, we're doing something different over here. And so I was really curious to kind of think about how just this one symbolic device was starting to craft a new subculture of organizing. And I was curious about the long-term connections between Palestine and Argentina, which are quite rich. Argentina had long-term relationship, both with Palestinian nationalists, also detractors. And of course, you know, very famously, Yasser Arafat and, you know, wanted to hang out with the Montoneros at some point and made a lot of tours of the Americas and had these sort of like very high profile supports, but maybe not necessarily a lot of kind of material supports to militancy in Argentina. And so I was curious about how this symbol, because it was a very powerful symbol. I can't even remember how many times I've seen photos of Firmenich and Arafat together reproduced, you know, in different publications, you know, especially in pamphlets and things like that during this period. And so, you know, it seemed to me that like this level of kind of symbolic practice and sort of interiorization of what it means to be in solidarity with another group was perhaps maybe a question to think about. So in self-presentation and in how individual movement actors view themselves and view their cause. So South-South solidarity as a way of kind of reshaping and reframing priorities within kind of a local struggle. And so, you know, I found that this, you know, at first I thought, okay, you know, this is something that's very trendy. Colin Farrell is also wearing the keffiyeh when he's going on his, you know, Hollywood tour stuff, doing his interviews. So maybe it's just a trendy thing, but it seemed to be even more lasting. And I remember that there were attempts to build coalitions while I was living in Argentina, where, you know, individuals might bring in the keffiyeh and talk about the PLO or talk about Palestine or talk about these past struggles as a way of talking through this line of what did it mean to be a part of those movements in the past, but to have, you know, kind of a different agenda than the one that was being framed as the problem with the left of the 70s, the problem with, you know, what was wrong with the leftists that didn't do things quite right in the 70s that led us to these problems in the 80s, a way of kind of walking around, saving the best parts of some of those struggles and kind of pushing aside some of the more dicey internal matters that they were wrestling with in order to kind of come together in these more broader movements. I felt like the use of Palestine as a symbolic object helped allowed some of this coalition building to build through pluralization, to articulate new points and new meanings to their points, to start identifying more with the global South more generally. And I often think of Pino Solanas and his campaign, you know, to kind of put a sur, you know, he's following many other traditions, but this being like his, you know, one of his big kind of key words, like thinking of the South and Argentina as this like home of the South, and that the idea that here, this director of Third Cinema, who was so famous around the world for this contribution, you know, would be at the centerpiece of this political struggle to kind of refashion the left, to start fitting with some of the concerns with neoliberalism that had been, you know, neglected by the traditional political parties. And so I thought that solidarity in Argentina with Palestine is an example of what these kind of movements can do in terms of creating this pathway space, this place of debate, this place of introspection. And I think that, you know, these relationships are, you know, because of course, Palestinians had relationships with Sandinistas, they have relationships with the FARC in Colombia, they have relationships with lots of people. And so, you know, I think that this is a way to understand that although maybe in each instance it's small, and maybe the kind of outgrowth of what happens as a result of these moments of solidarity isn't necessarily, sometimes it's Uruguayans showing up in Lebanon, you know, like once in a while that happens, you know, but that overall there is a way in which that struggle becomes a speaking point, a talking tool, and a way of refashioning the Latin American left and allowing it to grow into broader areas, articulating, you know, international positions that they might have if they would hold office, a way of kind of integrating some of the kind of earlier sentiments around what it means to be a citizen, what it means to include outsiders, newcomers, you know, reflecting some of the sort of sentiments of groups that were always excluded and seen as othered, and talking about them in a way that could help understand their struggle without pitting groups directly against each other. So I found that Palestinian nationalism could be used as a rallying cry with a distant cause, but also for very specific kind of local aims. Okay, go on to the last example here. The last, and I think it's the most controversial example, partially because the Catholic Church is such a complex organization. But I look at Latin American liberation theology. Again, this is a religious movement, a theological movement, but I also look at it as a social movement. I think about it as, and also as a messy social movement, one that's tied to a lot of other social movements. It's like, this is a space more than it is anything else. It's a place where things are happening. People are talking to each other, and ideas from various social movements are coming into conversation with each other and doing something together. So the argument that I make here is the idea that solidarity has to operate complexly when it's to be successful. Like, it doesn't often, you know, happen that A leads to B and has the exact outcome C that's intended. That sometimes solidarity can be articulated through a variety of different institutions, and the more diverse, the better, in a way. And so in looking at how the strategic maneuvers of these different Marxist intellectuals, these Catholic social activists, and these various kind of groups that were interested in liberation theology in Latin America influenced what was happening in Medellin, both before and after the big Vatican meetings. The way that they were able to kind of insert their ideas, to send text, to be useful to this process, the way they were able to even subvert the agenda of the organizers to create some conversation that would allow for challenges to the church's sort of need to reassess its position with respect to the modern world. The way that they were able to kind of like use very subtle critiques that came from theological principles of, taking care of the poor. The way they were able to subvert that to really kind of crack open unique spaces. And then the way that, because the church, as Christian Smith argues, is so hierarchical and so structured and so sturdy in many ways, it provided a safe transportation device for a lot of these ideas from one place to another. And so in South Africa, a lot of the organizers who from the 1930s into the 1950s, who were part of the Catholic social action movement, were already in many ways in dialogue. Like, a lot of them came from Ireland, from Italy, from other places. They were in dialogue with these trends. They were meeting with these people at congresses and having these conversations about colonialism, about fascism early on. And then when liberation theology offered a handful of really significant kind of critical insights into how to make a movement work in this way, they were primed. They were ready to take on these new structures and ideas. So in 1956, this idea is at least first articulated, this idea of creating kind of like a human rights watch organization on a national level that is attached to each of these different churches. By the time Medellin rolls around, it's almost presented as if, well, it's the least you can do to show you still care about the poor while we keep doing the traditional things. And so like it was almost adopted like as an afterthought. But peace and justice commissions end up being these incredibly transformative organizations in Africa. They help establish elections watching. They help maintain census data. They take care of refugees. They maintain asylum spaces. They circulate information from on the ground from local communities. Like when massacres were happening in South Africa, they were the first ones to get information out to international channels. And they keep circulating information among other progressive churches in the area, and religiously affiliated organizations like the Black Sash, which was a women's movement that was anti-apartheid. And so kind of creating these community spaces and having central kind of information sharing opportunities, having specific individuals with whom they have relationships in ongoing ways in the United Nations, in these, you know, the World Economic Forum, in these other spaces where they could sort of advocate for certain kinds of support was really critical in raising awareness and making sure that, you know, that there were events that were recorded, that people were counted, things like that, you know, really critical kind of basic data. But also, and this is probably, this is kind of a naughty, multi-sided thing that happens, but the economic boycott of South Africa, part of its intellectual kind of origin story comes from looking at the Chilean example and Pinochet. And so looking at how the banking system was failing in Chile was a major educational tool for the people who were organizing how to create a successful economic boycott of South Africa. And so there were direct sort of links between the study of the critical reflection on what went wrong in terms of support for Pinochet and how that was failing and how the banking system was being changed. Those critiques were directly implicated in thinking about where is this money hiding that's supporting the South African regime when even, you know, for example, the military is getting cut off from support to, you know, fund more of these policing forces, but how do they get more money? And finding like, here are the pathways, you know, it's the Toronto Bank is involved in this. And, you know, and if we can cut off these pathways, and then the state's going to have, like, there will be a scale back because there's just not, you know, the state doesn't have enough resources to do as much policing as this apartheid society to keep this particular shape would merit. So while it seems a much more kind of indirect and kind of many moving parts, like there's not the same person from one piece of it to the next, like there are all these different actors, but the way that these networks and these organizations have people that go between them, the way that they reinforce each other's missions, really protects the anti-apartheid movement for many ways against the death of a leader. You know, there are lots of different spaces of support, right? When the ANC is made illegal, there are all these different kind of multi-sided spaces of support for the ANC to kind of be able to kind of maintain it while it's in exile before it's able to kind of come back to South Africa. And so I think about the way that solidarity, sometimes when it's least visible, is most powerful. And this is a really good example because in all of these spaces, these activities were being done clandestinely. And you could say that the liberation theology movement failed to win all of the things it wanted in Latin America, but it certainly had an impact in creating spaces where clear organizing could happen, that could connect with the Black theology movement in South Africa, that could connect with ecumenical associations in South Africa. Desmond Tutu is reading the same kind of stuff that's influenced by these same people. Like the links are really clear. It's very obvious when you're there that these two things are connected, even though this may not have even been the original intention of those initial meetings, right? So I think of this as an important afterlife and an important way to kind of push us to think more broadly about why these movements were important and what significance the Latin American left had, you know, in shaping these kind of contemporary social realities that we're still living through. Okay. As a way of sort of concluding, I think this work complements a lot of other fantastic studies that have begun to think about South-South relationships. There are, I feel like every day about 20 new scholars writing brilliant papers, you know, showcasing Angola, Cuba, or Mexico, Nicaragua, like all kinds of relationships that previously were just not getting any attention at all. I think it's important that they stay in dialogue with each other and that we start to think about how the Latin American left remade internationalism in its own image during this period of the 60s and 70s and what the long-term consequences of that were. And kind of last but not least, I think that historians who have previously kind of thought about solidarity as more like humanitarian aid, you know, more like a mobilization of resources from one place to another. I think they're kind of missing this bigger mark. And Yassin Al-Haj Saleh, who writes in Syria, he, in the Civil War, he has kind of the best way of kind of framing what I hope is what we start kind of reconceptualizing, how we reconceptualize solidarity through thinking about South-South cases. He says, the failure to understand solidarity in the Global South is really a failure to understand partnership. And he says, partnership has no center. It works in multiple directions rather than in one. It's based on equality rather than power, and it's at odds with mutual competition and the polarization that follows therefrom. So I think he kind of speaks to both the goal of this project and really understanding beyond just who ends up having power and money and you know, getting to win the struggles, getting to set the tone of the historical narrative. He says, like, the way that we get past that is to quit thinking about power as the ultimate expression, you know, to start thinking about partnership, about relationship, about the internalized kind of political centers that become the way forward for these actors. And I hope that, you know, I hope that this is helpful to other scholars and in kind of thinking about their own research. I hope that they will look at this project in the way that it's been so collaborative, and also feel free to reach out to their local Middle Easternist who can speak Arabic, or their local Wolof speaker, and begin to start thinking about you know, where we look for our understandings of these places a little bit more broadly and profoundly. So thank you so much, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Really enlightening, everything you have said. You know, I wrote a lot.
I don't know if I can share the screen, but I do have a picture of the cover of the book.
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah, okay. There we go. Can you see? I don't know, I'm not sure what it's sharing with you.
That's perfect.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, the first edited volume that I was talking about, where we tried to recenter South-South solidarity, and then this is the current one here, South-South solidarity in the Latin American left. And the art's gorgeous, so I always like to show off the covers.
Yeah, yeah, it is indeed.
We'll work to publish it in Argentina. we have to work for that.
Yeah, I'm currently in the process of translating it to Spanish, because I really do hope it gets quickly to Spanish-speaking audience.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I think actually the translation's almost finished. It should be done the 30th of October, so I just need to find a publisher. So, yeah.
Perfect.
Does anyone have a question or comment or?
Not yet. I mean,
In YouTube.
Yeah.
I've never done with YouTube before. Do I have that window open as
There's
well?
a bit delayed, but just okay.
Maybe everybody's hungry and wants to go back. Also, absolutely fine. My email address is on UBC Okanagan website. It's jessica.steitz-more@ubc.ca. And if you have questions, you want to reach out, feel free. Like, it doesn't have to be today or now.
Yes, there's one comment. I wanted to ask Jessica what other significant experiences from Argentina she could locate in this activism within the arm left or in the human rights movement, and how that South-South solidarity of the 60s and 70s can be inspiring for forging new alliances and solidarity networks in the present right-wing advance, and how technological change in communication can be positively or negatively influence those networks.
That question is a great question. And I think, you know, filmmakers in Argentina are a big inspiration to me personally. There have been a number of different attempts to bring together Asian, African, and Latin American filmmakers that Argentines have spearheaded that, you know, have created spaces of dialogue, and also these campaigns of increasing awareness in critical spaces. Some of these, like the 60s and 70s, like I have a handful of really important kind of filmmaking movements that are already really well known and well studied, but they certainly don't end there. And in the kind of post-dictatorship era, they kind of pick up again. And I really find Cine Piquetero very interesting in particular, although it's, you know, I mean, this speaks to this question of new technologies. The handheld camera going through the streets doesn't always make for the easiest watching, but you know, Tamara Falakov and others argue that it creates this alternative news source for people on the ground that is really critical in kind of, you know, explaining some of the major issues, you know, that, you know, capturing horrible events that might otherwise be unknown, and helping to kind of craft relationships outside of Latin America, relationships of solidarity outside of Latin America. The films that were made in the 70s and 80s, they end up circulating around the world through human rights spaces, through universities, being shown in university classrooms, like in the University of Kansas, where I first watched Argentine films when I was a teenager. And so I think that, you know, one of the things that most inspired me to think about this period was the way in which Argentine cultural activists had, through exile spaces, really begun to kind of craft a response to the dictatorship, and then, you know, brought back this sensibility and even shaped a global sensibility about organizing among the global South. And, you know, I think this is something that, you know, Anne Garland Mahler also talks about, this idea of the global South being a Latin American kind of invention, you know, like a Cuban idea, but I also think of it as an Argentine idea, this, you know, this idea of the Southern Hemisphere being the space of connectedness and resistance. So yeah, I think that's one from Argentina that I would kind of point to first. Any other questions? I'm so glad the internet didn't cut out. I was really worried there. It's been a nightmare very recently, like just shutting down on its own, deciding when it's finished. Well, if there aren't any other questions, maybe I'll just say, you know, thanks to everybody again. It's really a delight to be a part of this series. I can't wait to hear what will be the next talk. And again, if anyone has questions or something they'd like to talk about, you know, independently with regard to your own research or something that I'm saying, maybe you want to have a disagreement, happy to have any of those conversations one-on-one, privately, or just send me an email. I'm happy to make time. So.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was very, very interesting.
Yes.
My
We're
pleasure.
still thinking.
Yeah.
I started to read the book. I started to read the book, and it's very, very inspiring.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity, and you know, UNLP is a very special place to me. So thank you again so much for hosting.
Thank you, Jessica. And tomorrow we'll have at 6 p.m. also The Devils in the Details, Sexual Violence and Corruption in the South American Football, from Brenda Elsley, no? And so see you tomorrow. I mean,
Sounds
everyone.
Great. Okay. Bye,
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.